I want to imagine for a moment that the story of the spies played out differently than it did. We know the tale as it stands. God and Moses have commissioned each tribe to send a representative into the land. The idea is to reconnoiter Canaan. Can the newly freed Hebrews enter safely? Can they find refuge in the land of their ancestors? Can they be victorious? 2 of these men bring back a hopeful report. 10 of them do the opposite. Caleb hushed the people before Moses and said, "Let us by all means go up, and we shall gain possession of it, for we shall surely overcome it." But the men who had gone up with him said, "We cannot attack that people, for it is stronger than we." Thus they spread calumnies among the Israelites about the land they had scouted, saying, "The country that we traversed and scouted is one that devours its settlers, Eretz Ochelet Yoshvea. All the people that we saw in it were men of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The Anakites are part of the Nephilim, and we looked like grasshoppers to ourselves, and so we must have looked to them." But what if the opposite had happened? Try to imagine for a moment how things would have played out if the story had gone this way. The spies say, "We came to the land that you sent us. It does indeed flow with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. However, the people who inhabit the country are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw the Anakites there." Now, so far, we have not changed a word. This is exactly as the text reads. And then Caleb hushed the people before Moses and said, "Let us by all means go up, and we shall gain possession of it, for we shall surely overcome it." And here's where I want us to imagine something different. What if the next part of the Torah had read as follows? Having heard Caleb's passionate plea, the men who had gone up with him said, "We are afraid, but our faith is strong. We will move forward despite our fears." And instead of spreading calumnies among the Israelites about the land they had scouted, they said, "The country that we traversed and scouted is not one that devours its settlers. Rather, it's one that sustains its inhabitants. While there are powerful forces aligned against us, while they are great in number, and we are relatively small, we see ourselves not as grasshoppers, but as giants. And since we looked like giants to ourselves, so we must have looked to them." And imagine what would have happened to the people if they had heard these stirring words. They wouldn't have railed against Moses and Aaron. They wouldn't have replied, as it says in our Parashat, "If only we had died in the land of Egypt. If only we could die in this wilderness." They wouldn't have said, "It would be better for us to go back to Egypt, back to enslavement." And having courageously declared their desire not to return to slavery and suffering, they would have avoided the near lynching of their leadership. The people wouldn't have threatened to pelt Joshua and Caleb, Moses and Aaron with stones. The situation wouldn't have required divine intervention, nor the disastrous consequence of 38 more years of wandering, of wilderness insecurity before the arrival to the promised land. Today, I want to consider flipping the script, selecting different narratives, and how to change, or a change in perspective can sometimes tell not just a better, but also a fuller and more accurate story. That moment of the spies returning with their negative report is telling, I think. It's not that they brought a completely fallacious story. There were elements of the tale that were true, of course. But their interpretation of the data was so skewed, it betrayed their deeply limited worldview. To the unimaginative leader, even good news is bad news. Rashi in the 11th century writes, "Joshua and Caleb did not take anything," meaning fruit, "although all of them were bidden to do so, because the very essence of the other spies' intention was only to bring an evil report. Keshem shepirya mishuneh, kach ama mishuneh." They said, just as the fruit was extraordinary in size, so its people are extraordinary in size. The 10 spies, well, they kind of weaponize bounty and abundance to tell a story of intractable suffering. And this is the point I want to make today. The Israelites' suffering was real. The story we tell at Pesach every year of our pain, of our enslavement before liberation is an essential part of our people's narrative. But it is only one part of our story. The Jewish people has been a story of thriving, of laughter, of joy. And in the places where our story has been one of pain, it's been simultaneously one of resistance, of bravery in the face of oppression, of love in response to hate. And our history is replete with trauma, to be sure, but we refuse to be defined by that, don't we? Instead, we celebrate our community orientation, our commitment to learning, to scientific discovery and literature, our ingenuity, our unique sense of humor, and how our particular sensitivity to othering and subjugation, yes, has shaped some of the best aspects of American culture. It was with these things in mind that I sat nonplussed this week as I considered the University of North Carolina's decision to withhold tenure from Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Nikole Hannah-Jones. This decision came as a refutation of faculty support from colleagues, and after conservative activists and a major donor, Walter E. Hussman Jr., expressed concern about her appointment. Now, on the face of it, the brouhaha was a reaction to Hannah-Jones' assertions about the colony's commitment to chattel slavery as a significant motivation for the Revolutionary War. But what's really at issue, I think, is the very premise of the 1619 Project itself. That project, the one that won Nikole Hannah-Jones the Pulitzer Prize, by the way, seeks to, quote, reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of our national narrative. It's about flipping the script. In other words, the point of the project is to provide a midrash of sorts, an alternate narrative to the white male-centered histories with which we were raised. With that, at best, have avoided nuance and balance, and at worst have erased the stories and silenced the voices of enslaved Africans and their descendants. But let me return to my earlier point about our Jewish story, because like our desire to celebrate the many contributions of Jews, African Americans, whether they're Jewish or Christian or Muslim or another religion or no religion, also hardly dwell on their trauma alone. A desire to center Black stories is not a prescription for telling only stories of woe. Trauma-informed is not the same as trauma-defined. That very point is central to the Hannah-Jones approach. It was Black activists, she says, who pushed for, who demanded expansion of civil rights, both during Reconstruction and much later during the 1950s and 60s. Just like it was women, argues Betham's own Elaine Weiss, who pushed for suffrage. And it was Native Americans who have demanded a reckoning around the destruction and displacement of indigenous peoples. And it's been LGBTQ folks, I might add, during this June Pride Month, who fought and fight for gay and trans rights. In Hannah-Jones's words, no one cherishes freedom more than those who have not had it. For her part, she explains, Black Americans, more than any other group, embrace the democratic ideals of a common good. We are the most likely to support programs like universal health care and a higher minimum wage, and to oppose programs that harm the vulnerable. For instance, Black Americans suffer the most from violent crime, she writes, yet we are the most opposed to capital punishment. Our employment rate is nearly twice that of white Americans, yet we are still the most likely of all groups to say this nation should take in refugees. But her point isn't just that Black Americans helped to define the struggle for human equity and justice. They have, just as Jews have done in our own way, helped to shape the very fabric of American culture. Hannah-Jones says this, the improvisational quality of Black art and music comes from a culture that, because of constant disruption, could not cling to convention. Black naming practices, so often impugned by mainstream society, are themselves an act of resistance. Our names belong to the white people who once owned us. That is why the insistence to give our children names that we create, that are neither European nor from Africa, a place we have never been, is an act of self-determination. When the world listens to quintessential American music, it is our voice they hear. Our speech and fashion, she continues, and the drum of our music echoes Africa, but is not African. Out of our unique isolation, both from native cultures and from our native cultures and from white America, we forged this nation's most significant original culture. In turn, mainstream society has coveted our style, our slang, and our song, seeking to appropriate the one truly American culture as its own. As Langston Hughes wrote in 1926, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. Crucially, she poses this question. What if America understood finally in this 400th year that we have never been the problem but the solution? So this week, after Nikole Hannah-Jones was deprived of tenure at a celebrated School of American Journalism, after 1,619 alumni and students at UNC Chapel Hill offered their support, we should think deeply on her question. Yes, how can we do better at understanding structural racism and the impact of white supremacy, but also, and equally important, how can we do better at celebrating Black culture, Black entrepreneurship, and Black humor? Indeed, this should be the story we tell of minority and traditionally marginalized communities as often as possible, because that is the story they passionately want others to hear. And it's also the story that they tell to each other and themselves. When I talked yesterday, as I was grabbing a cup of coffee with my friend Carlos Paez, Reservoir Hill neighbor, immigrant, coffee roaster, and owner of Cafe Los Sueños in Remington, he was in the midst of having the glass door of his shop replaced because someone shattered it during the night. Not any of the other doors or windows on the block, just his. And he's worried that he may have been targeted. And so am I. But Carlos also beams with pride about his thriving business and pointed out the terrific cicada sculpture affixed to his formstone storefront near the broken door. Cafe Los Sueños' installation for the Cicada Parada public art project is an homage to colorful Latin art and a tribute to Carlos' Salvadoran heritage. If you haven't seen these cicadas around Baltimore, you can go online and find them. They're really cool. LGBTQ pride is called that for a reason. This month we might consider not simply stories of violence and distress, but also homoerotic love poetry from none other than Yehuda Halevi, one of Judaism's greatest poets in Hebrew and liturgists, who in the 12th century wrote, Once when I fondled him upon my thighs, he caught his own reflection in my eyes and kissed my eyes. If I ask for the wine of his lips, he turns red like the sun as it sets, until from his visage I see how an Aramaean by name can turn out to be Edomite. You get it? Lavan, the Aramaean, white, the Edomite, red. It's about blushing. This poem and many other important writings are captured in A Rainbow Thread, Noam Sienna's wonderful anthology of queer Jewish texts from the 1st century to 1969. And yes, this week, as we mark the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre, it's essential not only to tell the story of hundreds of Black people who were murdered, thousands who were made homeless, The multi-day assault, the pogrom visited upon Tulsa's black population, but it's essential to tell the story of Greenwood, of Black Wall Street, of this important cultural and financial hub, which was beautiful before it was obliterated. Trauma-informed need not be trauma-defined. That's what Joshua and Caleb were trying to say on the precipice of the Promised Land all those millennia ago. When folks see themselves as grasshoppers, yes, others see them that way. When leaders do this, their own people tend to follow, unfortunately. But when we and others who have been made to feel like grasshoppers refuse to be minimized, too often those with an overinflated sense of their own importance, well, they try to diminish us anyway. The best defense against this subjugation is to flip the script, to stubbornly insist on affirmative narratives, on highlighting overlooked stories, on celebrating the achievements, great and small, of those who are great, so that no one can rightfully claim they're small. That's ultimately the lesson of the spies. 3,200 years ago, our people listened to the wrong story. A limited story, and ultimately a false story. The corrective to this failure, the lesson we must learn, is to tell and remember better stories. Shabbat Shalom.